July 5, 1950. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Smith stands on a rainy hillside north of Asan, South Korea, and watches the largest army he's ever seen advancing toward his position. Tanks, artillery, thousands of infantry, the North Korean People's Army in full assault mode. Smith commands 540 men. 540, against an enemy force that intelligence estimates at between 40,000 and 90,000
Without
troops.
those ships,
his
the
orders
UN
forces
simple:
might have
delay
never
the
pushed
enemy
back at all.
advance.
Hold as long as possible. But here's what nobody told him. He's not expected to win. He's expected to die. Task Force Smith isn't a fighting force. It's a speed bump, a human sacrifice to buy time for reinforcements. And the men under his command have no idea. Welcome to the most tragic story of the Korean War. You've heard about Task Force Smith. You know they were defeated. But what you probably don't know is that they were set up to fail from the beginning. This isn't a story about soldiers who weren't ready for combat. This is a story about men who were lied to, under-equipped, abandoned, and then blamed for a disaster that was orchestrated in Washington and Tokyo. This is about America's first troops sent to fight in Korea, and how they were sacrificed on an altar of political expediency. Let me take you back to June 25, 1950. North Korea invades South Korea with overwhelming force. The South Korean army collapses almost immediately. President Truman commits American forces to stop the invasion. General Douglas MacArthur, commanding U.S. forces in Japan, has to send troops immediately. The problem: his troops aren't ready for war. They've been occupation forces in Japan for 5 years. Easy duty, comfortable, soft, some would say. But they're all he's got. MacArthur orders the 24th Infantry Division to prepare for deployment. The division commander, Major General William Dean, selects the 21st Infantry Regiment. The regimental commander, Colonel Richard Stevens, selects 1st Battalion, and battalion commander Lieutenant Colonel Charles Smith gets the call: take a reinforced company, get to Korea, and stop the North Korean advance. Just like that. Stop an entire army with a few hundred men. Now here's what they told Smith: you're going to delay the North Koreans. Show them there are American forces in the fight. Once they see Americans, they'll slow down, maybe even halt. The presence of U.S. troops will change the equation. It was based on this insane assumption that North Korean soldiers would be intimidated by Americans, that they'd see the U.S. Army and just stop. As if warfare worked on reputation alone. What they didn't tell Smith: intelligence knew the North Koreans had excellent Soviet equipment, including T-34 tanks. Intelligence knew the North Korean army was well-trained, battle-hardened from fighting in the Chinese Civil War. Intelligence knew the invasion force was massive, well-supplied, and moving fast. And most importantly, command knew that a reinforced company couldn't possibly stop them. But they sent Smith anyway. Task Force Smith consisted of 540 men from B and C companies, 1st Battalion, 21st Infantry. They had individual weapons, M1 rifles, carbines, a few Browning automatic rifles. They had 2 mortar platoons with 4.2-inch mortars. They had a platoon of 75mm recoilless rifles. And they had 6 bazooka teams. That was it. No tanks. No air support immediately available. No artillery beyond their own mortars. Against an enemy that was bringing everything. The equipment they did have was questionable at best. The recoilless rifles were World War II surplus. The bazookas were 2.36-inch models, the same ones that had struggled against German tanks in World War II. Against Soviet T-34 tanks with their heavy armor, these bazookas were marginal at best. And the high-explosive anti-tank shells for the recoilless rifles. Many of them were defective, but nobody knew that yet. Smith's force flew into Korea on July 1, 1950. They were rushed to the front with minimal preparation. No time to scout the terrain properly. No time to establish proper supply lines. No time to coordinate with other units because there weren't any other units nearby yet. They were the first, the only. The sacrificial lambs. On July 4th, they moved into position on some low hills north of Asan. Smith picked the position based on the terrain. It overlooked the main road from Seoul. It was defensible, sort of. They dug in as best they could in the rain. The ground was muddy. Visibility was poor, and they waited. Private Kenneth Shadrick was one of the men in that position, 19 years old, from Wyoming. He'd been in the Army less than a year. In an interview he gave to a reporter the day before the battle, yes, there were reporters there because this was supposed to be a propaganda victory. He said he was excited to be part of stopping the communists. He believed they were going to make a difference. Kenneth Shadrick would be the first American soldier killed in the Korean War. He died the next day. July 5, 0816 hours. The first North Korean tanks appear on the road, 8 T-34 tanks moving south. Smith's men hold their fire, waiting for the tanks to get closer. The plan is to hit them with the recoilless rifles and bazookas at close range. Maximum effectiveness, or so they hope. At about 1,000 yards, Smith gives the order, the recoilless rifles fire. The first few rounds are direct hits. The shells slam into the tanks, and then, nothing. The shells don't penetrate. Some of them don't even explode. They're duds. Defective ammunition from World War II stockpiles that have been sitting in warehouses for 5 years. The tanks keep coming. The bazooka teams engage. They fire at the tanks from closer range. A few rounds hit. A few might have damaged the tanks slightly. But the 2.36-inch bazookas simply don't have enough penetrating power against T-34 armor. The tanks brush off the hits like mosquito bites and keep rolling. Now imagine you're one of Smith's soldiers. You've been told you're going to stop the North Korean advance. You've got what you were told was adequate anti-tank weaponry. You fire at the tanks, direct hits, and the tanks just keep coming. The shells bounce off or fail to explode. Your weapons don't work, and the enemy isn't stopping. The psychological impact is devastating. The tanks roll right through the American position. They don't even slow down. Some of them fire their cannons at American positions as they pass, but mostly they just drive through and continue south. Why would they stop? They've got objectives to reach. These few hundred Americans on a hillside aren't worth the delay. Behind the tanks comes the infantry, thousands of them. North Korean soldiers advancing in organized formations with artillery support, with mortars, with machine guns. And now Task Force Smith has to fight them. This is what they were actually supposed to do: delay the infantry, make them pay for every yard, buy time. And they try. God, how they try. The Americans open fire with everything they have. Rifles cracking, machine guns chattering, mortars dropping shells on the advancing enemy, and they're inflicting casualties. North Korean soldiers are falling. The advance slows. For a while it looks like they might actually hold. But the North Koreans bring up their artillery. They have real artillery, not just mortars. Heavy guns that start pounding the American positions. And the Americans have no counter-battery capability. They can't shoot back at the artillery because they don't have anything with that range. They just have to sit there and take it. The North Korean infantry starts flanking the American position. They're not just attacking head-on, they're moving around the sides, getting behind the Americans. Smith realizes his position is about to be surrounded. If they stay, they'll be cut off and destroyed. He gives the order to withdraw. The withdrawal turns into chaos. Units lose contact with each other in the rain and confusion. Equipment is abandoned. Wounded men are left behind because there's no way to carry them and fight off pursuers at the same time. The North Koreans pursue, cutting down fleeing soldiers. It becomes a rout. Task Force Smith suffered approximately 150 casualties, killed, wounded, or missing. Out of 540 men, that's nearly 30%. For an engagement that lasted only a few hours, those are catastrophic losses. And what did they accomplish? They delayed the North Korean advance by maybe 7 hours. 7 hours bought with American blood. But here's the part that should make you furious. This was always going to happen. The outcome was predictable. Anyone with basic military knowledge could have told you that a reinforced company without armor support, without adequate anti-tank weapons, without air cover, and without artillery support cannot stop a reinforced enemy division. It's not possible. The math doesn't work. So why were they sent? Politics, optics, the need to show that America was doing something. President Truman had committed to defending South Korea. MacArthur needed to demonstrate American resolve, and Task Force Smith was the demonstration. They were the message. American troops are here and we're committed. The fact that they'd be slaughtered sending that message, that was acceptable. That was the cost of the message. And here's what makes it worse. After the battle, after Task Force Smith was torn apart, the narrative became about American unpreparedness, about how the troops were soft from occupation duty, about how they weren't ready for combat. Generals and politicians pointed to Task Force Smith as evidence of what happens when the military isn't maintained at readiness. They used it to justify budget increases, force expansions, training reforms. All of which might be valid points, except they ignored the fundamental truth. Task Force Smith failed because they were sent on an impossible mission with inadequate equipment and no support. You can have the best trained soldiers in the world, and they still can't stop tanks when their anti-tank weapons don't work. You can have the most motivated troops imaginable, and they still can't hold against overwhelming numbers without support. Lieutenant Colonel Smith survived the battle. He made it out with part of his force and continued to fight throughout the rest of the war. In later interviews, and he was very careful about this while still in service, he defended his men absolutely. He said they fought as well as anyone could have under the circumstances. They followed orders. They stood their ground until standing was impossible, and then they withdrew in as good order as they could manage under fire. But privately, according to officers who knew him, Smith was bitter. He felt his men had been used, set up to fail, and then blamed for failing. He felt the military establishment had sacrificed his force, and then used that sacrifice as a political talking point rather than acknowledging the truth. Command sent them to die. Private Kenneth Shadrick, the first American killed, died trying to knock out a tank with a bazooka. He fired, the round bounced off, and return fire killed him. He was doing his job, following orders, trying to stop an enemy that he'd been told he could stop. And he died because the weapons he was given weren't adequate for the mission. 19 years old, from Skin Fork, West Virginia, he wanted to serve his country, and his country sent him to die on a hillside in Korea with weapons that didn't work, on a mission that couldn't succeed, for reasons that had nothing to do with military necessity. The survivors of Task Force Smith went on to fight throughout the war. Many of them were with the 24th Infantry Division during the desperate defense of the Pusan perimeter. They fought at Tajin, where General Dean himself was captured. They fought in the mountains and valleys of South Korea through that brutal summer of 1950, and they never forgot July 5th. In unit reunions decades later, survivors would talk about that day, about the tanks that wouldn't stop, about the shells that didn't explode, about friends who fell and couldn't be recovered, and about the feeling of betrayal when they realized they'd been sent on a mission that was designed to fail, that they were expendable. Here's something else that doesn't get talked about enough. The equipment failures at Task Force Smith exposed massive problems in the American military that had been ignored for years. The defective ammunition, the inadequate anti-tank weapons, the lack of proper supply chains, the absence of combined arms coordination. All of these problems existed throughout the Far East Command. Task Force Smith just happened to be the unit that discovered them under fire. After Task Force Smith, there was a frantic effort to get better equipment to Korea. 3.5-inch bazookas, the Super Bazooka, were rushed to the front. They were effective against T-34 tanks, but they arrived too late for Task Force Smith. New ammunition was shipped from the United States, better anti-tank mines, more modern recoilless rifles, all the things that should have been there from the beginning. And American tanks started arriving. M24 Chaffees first, then M4 Shermans, eventually M26 Pershings. Suddenly, American forces could meet North Korean armor on something approaching equal terms. But in early July 1950, Task Force Smith had none of this. They had World War II surplus and hope. The North Korean advance continued after overrunning Task Force Smith. They pushed south rapidly, forcing American and South Korean forces into the Pusan perimeter. It would take the Incheon landing and weeks of brutal fighting to reverse the situation. But in those early days, American forces were desperately buying time. Every day mattered. Every hour mattered. And Task Force Smith bought 7 hours with 150 casualties. Was it worth it? That's the question Smith's survivors struggled with. From a cold, strategic perspective, maybe yes. Those 7 hours contributed to the overall delay that allowed forces to establish the Pusan perimeter. Every unit that fought and fell back, including Task Force Smith, added time to the clock. And time was what MacArthur needed to build up forces for a counteroffensive. But from a human perspective, from the perspective of the men who died or were wounded or captured, they deserved better. They deserved to be sent into battle with working equipment. They deserved adequate support. They deserved a mission that had some chance of success. They deserved honesty about what they were being asked to do. Instead, they got lies, false hope, and defective ammunition. They got sent to delay an army with weapons that couldn't stop tanks. They got ordered to hold a position that couldn't be held. And then, after they were torn apart doing exactly what they were told to do, they got blamed for being unprepared. The Task Force Smith Monument stands today in South Korea near where they fought. It commemorates the first American ground combat in the Korean War. It honors the men who fought and died there. But it doesn't tell the full story. It doesn't talk about the defective shells or the inadequate bazookas or the impossible mission. It just says they fought, which they did, bravely and well, given what they had to work with. But monuments don't tell the full truth. They give us the sanitized version, the heroic narrative. And there was heroism at Task Force Smith, no question about that. Men standing their ground against overwhelming odds. Men trying to stop tanks with weapons they knew probably wouldn't work. Men holding the line until the last possible moment. That's courage. But it's not the whole story. The whole story includes the commanders who sent them there knowing they'd probably die. The whole story includes the politicians who needed a demonstration of American resolve and were willing to spend American lives for it. The whole story includes the supply failures and equipment problems that had been ignored for years until men started dying because of them. Task Force Smith was the first American unit to fight in Korea, but they weren't just first in the chronological sense. They were first in another sense, first to be sacrificed for political reasons, first to discover that the military wasn't as ready as everyone claimed, first to learn that sometimes your own command can be more dangerous than the enemy. The Korean War would go on for 3 more years. 3 years of brutal fighting, massive casualties, political frustration, and eventual stalemate. But it started with Task Force Smith on a rainy hillside, 540 men trying to stop an army with inadequate weapons and false promises. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Smith died in 1994. In his obituary, his service in Korea was mentioned, including his command of Task Force Smith. It noted that he'd been awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions. It called him a hero. And he was. He led his men as well as anyone could have under impossible circumstances. But I wonder what he thought about in his final years. Did he think about July 5, 1950? Did he think about the men he lost? Did he think about the shells that didn't explode and the tanks that didn't stop? Did he think about being sent on a mission that couldn't succeed and then watching history blame his men for failing? We'll never know. He didn't talk about it much publicly. Like a lot of veterans, he kept his thoughts to himself. But the men who served with him, the survivors who made it off that hillside, they knew. They knew what really happened. They knew they'd done everything possible with what they had, and they knew they'd been set up to fail. Task Force Smith, first to fight. First to fall. First to be forgotten by everyone except the men who were there and the families of those who didn't come back. They deserve better than to be remembered as a failure. They deserve to be remembered as men who did their duty under impossible circumstances, with inadequate equipment, on a mission designed to sacrifice them for political messaging. That's the truth about Task Force Smith, not the sanitized version, not the heroic legend, the truth. 540 men sent to stop an army, told they could do it, given weapons that didn't work, abandoned without support, torn apart, blamed, and then used as an example of what not to do, as if they were the ones who failed rather than the system that sent them there. July 5, 1950, the day America entered the ground war in Korea, the day we learned we weren't as ready as we thought, the day 540 men paid the price for everyone else's mistakes. That's Task Force Smith. That's their story. And that's something we should never forget, because the men who were there never could.